Hello and welcome back to History of Philosophy, and here in Module 9 we're going to look at what's called the Scottish Enlightenment. There are other philosophers such as Francis Hutcheson, but here we're going to be looking at Adam Ferguson and Adam Smith. Again, like the other courses, because we have a fair amount of material to cover, I like to break it down into sections in order to kind of anchor these ideas into a reality that in this particular case is especially important. Okay. So the first thing is to define the time and the era of the Scottish Enlightenment. What was it? How was it different from previous eras? And then also the fact that it was part of a general sort of age of revolutions. And we have an industrial revolution, the American Revolution, the French Revolution. So we're going to take a look at those and see how the Scottish Enlightenment sort of segue and fit into this sort of larger purview of social and political upheaval. Then we're going to take a look at two specific people, Adam Ferguson and then Adam Smith, and then finally some concluding thoughts. So the Scottish Enlightenment is a period in the early 18th century, the early 1700s, in the intellectual life of Scotland, and the characteristics were the following. There was an absolutely remarkable production of philosophical, intellectual, legal, architectural, and scientific accomplishments. Science is now in full swing, and what had been fairly, and I don't want to be sort of almost racist in saying this, but Scotland was a country that was developing. I'll say, let's put it that way. Compared to England, Scotland was a more developing nation compared to perhaps a developed nation. But in very short order, Scotland was able to catch up to the rest of the United Kingdom in this remarkable production of ideas, of architecture, of science. And so the Enlightenment is a kind of group of individuals that are, as you can see, sort of scattered about these different disciplines of architecture, of writing, of thinking and philosophizing and science. And because there were universities in Glasgow, Edinburgh, Aberdeen, that really helped to cement the relationships between these different individuals and the world in which they lived. Through these schools, along with the close reading of new books and discussion, very open and frank discussions regarding new ideas, something that was not possible in France, Scotland was able to really put itself on the map in terms of intellectual development, and especially in terms of the quality and the amount of new ideas that were also coming from the continent. So the Scottish Enlightenment, because it was part of the Enlightenment that also included France and Germany, it shared some similar qualities and characteristics that the rest of the Enlightenment mode or Enlightenment period experienced in Western Europe. So there was a deep thinking about humanity, humanism, and human relationships. There was also this mechanistic view of the world that we talked about last week with Thomas Hobbes and the week before with Descartes. Same kind of thing is going on now with Scotland. So contemporary humanist, mechanistic, and rationalist outlooks that were very similar to those from the continental philosophers. So we can see there are some parallels between the ways individuals had been thinking. For example, the specific people that we have looked at over the last 2 weeks, Descartes, in a very similar way. The Scottish also thought about the importance of human reason and the way in which any rejection of authority is really the way to go. Unless you can justify that ancient authority figure, you better strike it on your own and rethink what's going on. So the importance of human reason in not only rejecting previous authority figures, but using that as a tool to move forward, to think about the present and especially the future. This was something Descartes and the Scottish Enlightenment, they traded in these kinds of ideas. Locke and Bacon, both of them English, also had this sort of somewhat optimistic view of individuals to use reason, right? And to use reason in such a way that it would actually bring about positive change and changes in nature, in society, human conduct, and relationships between, for example, the state and its citizens. So, the Scottish Enlightenment were both slightly different, but also very similar to the Enlightenment movements that were happening in France, England, and in Germany. Now, what distinguishes them from the others are the following things. The Scottish Enlightenment combined empirical thinking, so thinking from the senses. They were very practical, and they had a very strong sort of understanding of common sense. So consider Plato, consider other idealists that we've discussed so far, and how the notion of practicality and common sense isn't really in their purview, right? It's not in their wheelhouse. But the Scottish Enlightenment and those thinkers, Hutcheson and David Hume and Smith and Ferguson, all of them were empiricists, right? They were empirical materialist thinkers who were very practical and had a very common sense use of reason. And so the Scottish Enlightenment focused on social improvement, on civic virtues, which they had learned from Aristotle, and also from the very practical benefits that were created by having a fully rounded citizen slash subject slash individual living in society and being a generally happy person. And so all these things, the degree of common sense in the Scottish Enlightenment is quite remarkable. So what is happening here is the Western world is waking up to science, waking up to reason, and it has to wait until the 18th century, the 1700s, for these kinds of disciplines to even have the opportunity to begin to grow. So in the work of the Scottish Enlightenment, and of course some of the work of the other Enlightenment movements on the continent, we have the theoretical foundations of disciplines like sociology, political economy, anthropology. These disciplines don't yet exist. But what is remarkable is the fact that the Scottish Enlightenment and these other Enlightenment movements set the kind of theoretical stage, right? The ideas that are going to underpin some of these ideas that are developed further in these new disciplines, especially sociology and political economy. So throughout history, we have a number of different thinkers who are perhaps at the wrong place at the wrong time, may have the same ideas, but there is possibly attacks by the established church. There is the fact of censorship. New ideas are rarely welcomed with open arms by the powers that be. So the Enlightenment, knowing that, of course, in Scotland, it was much more open than in France. The European Enlightenment was facing criticism, both positive and negative, as to what they could do, right? The state of affairs was such that the monarchy and the church were all powerful. And so if that's the case, whatever you present needs to be a viable alternative. You can't just sit and criticize. You've got to say, well, here's what we present. This is what the Scottish Enlightenment was really focused on doing, presenting ideas that could be acted upon for the future to make the world a better place. So one necessary condition for any kind of critique of society is unlimited freedom of expression and thought. And where is that from? The ancient Athenians. If you remember back to the first week, they were very clear on the fact that any kind of intellectual development, scientific development, has to occur in the realm of freedom. Without freedom of expression, you will now stymie or thwart or just outright stop developments that otherwise could be happening at that time. So the Scottish Enlightenment were lucky enough to have a fairly open and tolerant society into which to introduce these ideas. But in other parts of Europe, and France in particular, that was a lot more difficult. Now, why would presenting new ideas be dangerous? Well, it turns out that there's a real good reason why the powers that be are afraid of new ideas. Because while this is going on, this was also known as the Age of Revolutions. And there are three very important ones that are in the back of the minds of those who are in power, who need to carefully consider what options they have in terms of tolerating new ideas and then possibly being overthrown as a result of these ideas being presented and acted upon. So while the Scottish Enlightenment and the French and the British Enlightenment figures, the German as well, because this is roughly happening in the 1700s, around the world, well, a couple of places in particular, which is France and then America and then across Western Europe, are these three revolutions, each slightly different, one in particular very different, but the first one we need to consider is the American Revolution. And as a result of the overthrow of British rule, the British monarchy on U.S. soil, because at this point there's only 13 states, the American Revolution resulted in the establishment of the first Republican government in modern times. Now, what is a Republican government? This is a government based on the rule of law, that there are laws by which people need to follow in order to behave. And the rule of law is something that was discussed briefly last week when we talked about social contracts, that those laws need to be in place that allow for the natural rights of citizens to be respected. Life, liberty, the pursuit of happiness, which is the American dream, quote unquote. In the American Revolution are the seeds of this Republican government, the first one in modern times. Now, when we say that, the ancient Athenian polis, it also was a republic in terms of being founded on the rule of law. And that pretty well disappears for almost 1,500 years, because with the advent of the Roman Empire and then the power of the church, there's no need for a republican government. The church is all. The church is everything. They set the agenda. They set the laws. Whether or not they result in happiness is irrelevant. So it takes until the 1700s for these ideas to take hold in the minds and the hearts and minds of individuals. And as a result, there are three different revolutions that go on. The first one, the American Revolution, and the ideals of equality and personal happiness, they are now the linchpin, right, of the social and political system. So equality and personal happiness, that should sound familiar. Where is that from? John Locke, right? His two treatises of government. And also to a certain degree, Rousseau, but really Locke and other writers like Thomas Paine were writing along the same lines, but the ideals of equality and personal happiness are literally built into the laws. And so the success of the American Revolution is now sort of considered to be exportable to other parts of the world. Another revolution, similar, happening at just about the same time, slightly later though, is the French Revolution. Much more traumatic, much more violent, inspired by a series of political events, and including the beheading of King Louis XVI, Marie Antoinette, many church figures. It was basically a reset, right? A reset back to zero. And the French Revolution also becomes a kind of exportable model for other revolutions. The difference is that the French Revolution had the monarchy right then and there. So the monarchy was on the same soil. The American Revolution, basically you were fighting an enemy from the other side of the Atlantic. Yes, there were British forces in America, but it wasn't an opportunity, or there wasn't an opportunity to go and behead a monarchy, right, in public. That's a huge, huge deal. The French Revolution did. So more traumatic, more violent, more bloody, lasted much longer. So as you can see, it lasted almost 15 years. But the result is that this entirely new system of government is replacing the useless, antiquated, reactionary monarchy of King Louis XVI. And again, the same sort of thing. The notion of equality and happiness are part and parcel of that charter of rights that is generated out of this revolution. And of course, France may not have had this kind of religious intolerance in the past, but certainly at the point, there was great intolerance in this strange sort of symbiotic relationship between the church and the state, or the church and the monarchy. And as a result of this, the tension that's built up between the unhappiness of the citizens and the monarchy that essentially doesn't care, there begins to develop this political consciousness, right, within a large group of people. And part of it was simply growing tired of aristocratic rights and privileges and the fact that these people appeared to be above the law. And there was no way to reform. And if you cannot reform and evolve, then you are going to have to revolt. And that's precisely what happened. Now, the third one is not political, but it's certainly social. The third one is the Industrial Revolution. Now, some people begin the Industrial Revolution in 1660 with the invention of the steam engine, but really it begins in earnest about 100 years later in 1760. And really, I mean, it could still be going on if you want to be truthful about it, but certainly between 1760 and 1840, when Germany, which was the last country in Western Europe to become industrialized, that's why it's around 1840. So during this period of time, roughly 80 years, there were no political systems that were overthrown, but certainly what did happen is an absolutely utter transformation of social economic structures, first in Western Europe, and then, of course, unlike the revolutions, which are uneasily exportable, the Industrial Revolution was very much exportable to the rest of the world. And so the Industrial Revolution grew very slowly, but it grew inexorably. It couldn't turn back. The revolution had to move forward because so many minds were set on making this better and better. Division of labor. More and more scientists and engineers and entrepreneurs were investing money in factories, in better and more efficient ways to do things. All of these things may not have affected a political system per se, but it absolutely transformed and revolutionized social and economic structures, because now these social and economic structures were aligned along capitalist interests. And that's the part that is really revolutionary, because capitalism had been in existence since probably about the 1400s in a basic form, but harnessed onto the Industrial Revolution, that's when it essentially hit the ground running. And transformations were done so rapidly that even some individuals in their own lifetime could see such a profound change in their living status that it was a remarkable feat. And really the word revolution is the only way to describe it. So the age of revolution, the one that really sort of has the most prolonged effect and still does today, is this Industrial Revolution. Because what we have is this transition now from all kinds of sort of hand production methods, artisans using simple machines, to now we have more efficient use of machines, chemical manufacturing, iron production, the use of water power, the use of steam, machine tools, division of labor. All of these things together worked in harmony with one another to create a more effective industrial revolution, or at least a more and more effective industrialized state. So this is really what ends up happening. There are cheaper ways to make things, and now what does happen is artisans are essentially thrown out of work. And so that's part of that social upheaval. Yes, economically, in Scotland in particular, industrialization did help. Fewer people were starving, more people were working, the birth rate went up, but also the death rate went down because people lived longer. They were healthier. They could actually plan for the future, buy a home. So in Scotland, the positive and optimistic view and the common sense view of industrialization was a far different one than what, let's say, Germans had about 100 years later. So there is a remarkable transition in the way people lived prior to the revolution, the industrial one, and then after. So we see that this revolution perhaps has been the most effective in changing the way people live. So literally every aspect of daily life is changed. So income, population, everything is more sustained. There's more growth. People are just generally healthier and better off. And the standard of living for the general population increases for, in fact, the first time in history. And that is really the remarkable piece. So along with the French and American Revolution, which are primarily political, and the Industrial Revolution, which is primarily economic, we have other revolutions too that are a direct result of this kind of revolutionary activity. And there's three of them. The first one is the breakup of the feudal system. Now, the feudal system is basically lords and manors and duchies, and we've got serfs that are working the land on behalf of a baron or a lord, and they're allowed to live on this little chunk of land that they'll never own, but they have to till the soil and give up 90% of what they produce to the lord, who then sends it somewhere else and sells it to somebody, and of course keeps all the profits. So that system begins to break down because industrialization actually gives serfs and people who would otherwise be poor the opportunity to work somewhere and to perhaps make a little bit more money that they can keep in their pockets, right? That is what makes it so revolutionary. So the Industrial Revolution offers the opportunity for people who would otherwise be working as part of a feudal system to end up working somewhere else. So that system breaks down over a period of about 100 years. As well, there is now finally the complete and absolute freedom of expression that is available now to thinkers. And again, by the end of the French Revolution, the kind of censorship that was there because of the church and the monarchy is gone. Now, let's not kid ourselves. It's replaced by a different kind of censorship, which is political in nature, because as you can imagine, nobody wants to live in a revolution forever. You want the revolution to be over, things to settle down, and you want people to be able to go about their business. So throughout the early 1800s, there is, in Germany in particular, and also in France, a real close eye being kept on writers who may not be entirely happy with the way things are going, whether it's a movement in industrialization, a movement in political structures. So yes, complete and absolute freedom of expression, generally speaking. But if you're writing about politics and writing about revolutionary ideas, that becomes a lot more difficult. Those ideas are much more difficult to disseminate to others, simply because the kind of censorship that the state is now enforcing is one that wants to make sure, once again, that they remain in power. Even if they are voted in or out, the state itself as an entity remains intact. So yes, there is freedom of expression, that is true, but depending on the content of that expression, it may be also under the scrutiny of the censor's eye. The last one too is new scientific techniques, investigating and analyzing, interpreting material. Now, a lot of it was within that narrow confines of further industrialization. It's true, but still scientific techniques of investigation and analysis were being carried on. There was now the money to invest in eradicating certain health issues, whether it was polio, whether it's other illnesses that could be dealt with through scientific research. Because with telescopes and microscopes and scientific devices to really look at the Earth in its most minutest, smallest parts and the most largest and vastest of cosmos, those scientific techniques of investigation always yielded up information that was valuable and worth pursuing. So, breakup of the feudal system, a fair degree, not absolute maybe, but a fair degree of freedom of expression, and continued scientific investigating. All of those things good. So all of this comes together because it is needed, right? Through sheer necessity. How do we make this system more effective? How do we bring it about so that we can have a society that functions, allows people to work, allows people the opportunity to better themselves? Because remember, the state is going to be able to create happy citizens if it can provide laws that protect the pursuit of life, liberty, happiness, and equality. If the state can do that, the likelihood of revolutionary activity kind of settles down. It quells it to a certain degree. But that doesn't last very long because industry needs certain laws that protect it from a variety of different outside factors. It wishes to continue to develop and maximize profits. And over time, laws now seem to be as much, if not more, concerned with protecting industry than it is protecting individuals in the state. So let's keep that in mind. But at this particular time, through sheer necessity, all of these factors are working together to bring about this idea of a modern society. And the idea of a modern society really does begin in earnest in the late 1700s. Now, when we think about modernism, it depends on where we're looking and what countries we're looking at. But certainly during the 18th century, we have the work of Rousseau, Montesquieu, another French writer, Saint-Simon, writing in the 1800s, Vico, also writing in the tail end of the 1600s, and then, of course, the Scottish Enlightenment. So all of these individuals are looking and thinking about and reflecting upon this new thing called modernity. And it is something that is utterly unlike anything which has come before. And we'll see over the next few weeks how difficult dealing with modernism was and modernity. Because, and I'm going to cut to the chase here and sort of give you a little spoiler, what ends up happening is we have thinkers and philosophers trying to deal with new problems with old tools. So keep that in mind as we work through the next few weeks. But this idea of that kind of sociological approach to the complexity of modernism, it begins here, right? It begins here with the Scottish Enlightenment. So we're going to take a look at the first person that we want to study, which is Adam Ferguson. Okay, so Adam Ferguson is thinking about progress in a positive, optimistic manner, right? The intellectual progress of science, mathematics, is now at a point where it's now being placed at the service of inventing machinery, right? All this machinery to replace human labor and increase, of course, material production, so we can make more sweaters, more tables and chairs for people so that they have something to wear, somewhere to sit and eat and have dinner. Because prior to that, you would have to look for an artisan to make this thing. So the invention of machinery, the invention of the division of labor, all of these things at that time in the late 1700s were looked at very optimistically, right? And looked at positively, because these new economic forces of production were not only changing society, but at that time changing it for the better. Because of where Scotland was at that time, it was really worth celebrating and praising these intellectual achievements that were being expressed through industrialization. So this group of Scottish Enlightenment thinkers started what they called the science of man. I apologize, that's what it was called. But it is a kind of proto-sociology. There's something really interesting in their work because, again, it's grounded in reality. It's grounded in empirical observation and research. But this is the beginnings of sort of a little bit of anthropology and a little bit of sociology. But it's called at this point the science of man, the science of humanity. And so this new approach tried to begin to combine society, politics, and economics. And this is what we see in Ferguson's first book, An Essay on the History of Civil Society, published in 1767. So what was Ferguson doing? What he was trying to do is to look at this utterly new situation and look at the things that should be salvaged, right? The things that should be maintained. Now, I mentioned last week, any law, and in fact today as well, any law that promotes and helps the pursuit of life, liberty, happiness, equality, and all these good positive things that are natural rights, those things are good. And so Ferguson was looking at this new modern society, and he said, okay, what do we have in the past that would allow us to continue to live well, even though we're dealing with this brand new thing called industry? So what Ferguson did is he looked backwards to the ancient tradition of citizenship, courage, civic virtue, and all of these are ideas that were originally present in ancient Athens. And so he takes those good things from ancient Athens, in particular from the writings of Aristotle, and he applies them to the modern state. He looks to see whether there's something in the modern state that is either similar to ancient Athens, and if not, is there something from ancient Athens that we can import into this modern world? And he thought, yes, absolutely. Because if we are going to progress economically, we need to progress in terms of human beings. So Ferguson placed his faith in people, in morality, the possibility that moral perfection was possible. And so this is the kind of thinking that would be aligned with Locke, because again, Locke had a pretty kind and optimistic view of individuals and the state of nature. So did Ferguson. Again, positive, optimistic, common sense, and so on. And so, like Hobbes as well, Ferguson also was aware of the power of self-interest and utility. But here's where he's different. He says, okay, there is a degree of self-preservation, like Hobbes, but there is also the notion of utility. what is useful in society to better a person's life. And so those are all good ideas, but he also states that these should be aligned with a moral law. In other words, even though we can make a choice in this industrialized modern society to cheat and lie and manipulate, we try not to. We try to take the high road. So if we can follow a moral law, still engage in self-preservation, then we're likely to be okay. And this is something that at the beginning is entirely possible. People make the right decisions. They're not morally bankrupt, quite the opposite. So Ferguson had a real strong faith in people to do the right thing because their moral compass was still intact. This was early enough in industrialization and modernity that people's moral compasses were still strong, were still solid. They were still aware that you could make choices, both good and bad. And the hope was that most people would do the right thing. So where there was a problem was in the Scottish Enlightenment thinkers, really their understanding of modernity at the beginning was very positive, optimistic, common sense, like I say. But what they started to do was move away from philosophy proper. Ferguson looked at Aristotle, his virtue ethics, for example, the notion of community, and they moved away from philosophy as they knew it, because remember, this is the late 1700s. They moved away from the world of ideas and concepts and tried to come up with something that they could realize in the world, right? Not about the world or derived from, but something that could be realized in the material world of society and politics. So they become sort of the first modern philosophers, because prior to that, Plato and Aristotle and Descartes, Descartes is on the cusp, but these earlier philosophers were conducting philosophy proper. They weren't so concerned about society so much. They're more concerned with formulating concepts, right? Formulating ideas about the world. What the Scottish Enlightenment are trying to do is come up with ideas that may already exist or come up with their own, but always making sure that they're anchored very clearly in the material world of society and politics. So that makes them some of the very first people to try to struggle with what modernity was, right? And by comparison to older and more traditional ways of thinking. So here's one of the ways in which older forms of thinking really were not applicable. Much like, and I had mentioned this when we first talked about Plato and Aristotle, mythological thinking at that time in the ancient world eventually couldn't speak to the concerns of the individuals of that time, because they were talking about democracy, they're talking about economics, they're talking about things that mythology just didn't know anything about. The same sort of thing is beginning to happen here, where Ferguson and Smith as well are looking at modern commercial society and noticing that the things that made the ancient world work, which is civic and communal virtues, were beginning to wear away. They were beginning to erode because notions of citizenship, participation, and so on, these things really were the glue that held together the ancient polis, right? That ancient city-state. And Ferguson was critical of the fact that the things that he wanted to save in the modern world were in fact the very things that were fading away and making the world modern. So civic and communal virtues in particular were really starting to fade away. Because if people had to work, they had to move somewhere where there was work. That would mean leaving your family, your friends, your community, moving somewhere else, being surrounded by strangers, being in a new place. It might even be a new country, but certainly another part of the country that you're living in, because you have to work. And so what is happening here is those deep human ties that individuals have to one another are really being tested by the demands of industrialization to go where the work is. And students, you know exactly what this means. You may live in one country and you've had to move somewhere else to go to school, and that's just the way it is, right? So the civic virtues that were based on and built upon these these deep ties to the community and to friends and family, they are sorely being tested because now you've got to go somewhere else. And that somewhere else is either to go to school or to work or both. And so Ferguson was really having trouble with reconciling the positive view that he had of industrialization with the increasingly negative view that he was having of society and the price society had to pay for all of these changes. So Ferguson saw no distinction between the sphere of commerce and other aspects of public life. They were really one and the same. So when you looked at the family, and then you had the state, which is sort of the political structure, in between would be civil society. And in fact, that's what the name of the book is, Civil Society. It's in that middle section that individuals get to interact with one another, but only in terms of goods and services, not necessarily as friends or acquaintances or someone that you will have a long-lasting relationship. You're writing a contract with someone, you're engaging with them economically, not on really any other deeper level than simply economically. So this is something that really concerned Ferguson, that perhaps society was going to suffer in the long run because of the demands that industrialization was making on people and the way in which they had to interact with one another in a kind of transactional sort of way. And if that's the case, then it makes dealing with people not a deep and abiding friendship, but simply a kind of transactional way where you have something I need and I will offer my services for amount of money and so on. All of these things really were testing Aristotle's ethics of virtue. And Ferguson knew them really, really well. But Ferguson believed in human freedom, economic liberty, providing it was tempered with moral philosophy. And that's where he needed to make the change. So moral philosophy for Aristotle looked very different and sounded very different than it did at this point, right? Than it does now in the late 1700s. So if he could come up with a modern version of moral philosophy that applies to this new industrialized modern society, then maybe there's a chance we can make it through. And so this is what he worked on. So for him, the end of a tradition didn't mean the end of concepts that lose their power. It means that those concepts need to be rethought, right? So those concepts sometimes seem that this power becomes even more influential as a tradition loses its living force with reality, such as morality, such as virtue. So it becomes more influential. It becomes something that we need. But the more industrialization develops, the more it begins to lose that force, right, with the social reality in which it exists. So he writes in part 3, quote, mankind, in following the present sense of their minds, in striving to remove inconveniences, or to gain apparent and contiguous advantages, arrives at ends which even their imagination could not anticipate, and pass on like other animals in the track of the nature without perceiving its ends. He who first said, I will appropriate this field, I will leave it to my heirs, did not perceive that he was laying the foundation of civil laws and political establishments. So what Ferguson is talking about here is behaviors that really set the stage for ideas such as private property. The fact that you can appropriate a field by putting a fence around it and calling it your own, and by tilling the soil, you now lay claim to it. Now, this is an idea that also existed in Locke, because if you see the word remove inconveniences, that should be a little trigger word. Right, Locke talked about that, the inconveniences of the state of nature. Well, the inconveniences here are similar, but what's happening is they're harnessed to economic imperatives. So, as he says, the first person who said, I will appropriate this field, I will call this my own, I will put a fence around it, I will till the soil, I will raise cattle on it, I will raise, wheat or some exportable product, never realized at the time that they were laying the foundations for a radically new way of interacting with the world and interacting with the world along at a kind of economic manner. So a very different view of the world. So Ferguson also believed that human beings belong equally to a divine nature, right? The natural history created by God, as well as this progressive social history that's created by human beings. Because if you remember back to Plato, Plato said that reason was our connection with the gods, right, in the plural. And so Ferguson kind of looked at it the same way, that we had a kind of divine natural history and looked at the movement of history as something that was not only ordained by us, but also divinely ordained. This is what God wanted us to do. That's the way he looked at it. And so he said, if that's the case, let's not lose sight of the fact that this is a gift from God. Reason is a gift from God, which has allowed us to create this industrialized world. But we need to make sure that we pursue progress properly, that we do it morally. So human beings, for Ferguson, being the positive person that he was, did not act selfishly for themselves, but instead acted sort of unbeknownst to themselves in a kind of providential plan, right? So God's providence was what was leading these individuals to develop better and more effective forms of industrialization. Again, all looked at very good. This was all something that was very normal and relevant. So what did all this mean? What it meant was that Ferguson looked at industrialization and the Industrial Revolution not only as a good thing, but as part of this providential plan that was laid out by God for us to follow through. So the notion of natural progress, social progress, was tinged with this sort of religious dimension that we are destined to do this. This is who we are. This is us at our best. But let's not forget, us at our best is also to be a moral individual. So there was always that attempt to anchor everything that we were doing within that moral dimension. So the uninhibited growth of commercial society was still okay because it included our attempts at self-preservation. We wish to live a better and better life. And the fact that it was also God's ordained plan for us to do this really allowed Ferguson to give industrialization a pretty sort of positive sheen. And really, that's the way he was thinking. So whatever was happening to us, provided we did the right thing, we would not lose sight of the bigger picture, which is that all of this was part of God's ordained plan. So he writes, yet one property by which man is distinguished has been sometimes overlooked in the account of his nature, or has only served to mislead our attention. In humankind, the species has a progress as well as the individual. They built in every subsequent age on foundations formerly laid, and in a succession of years tend to a perfection in the application of the faculties, into which many generations must have combined their endeavors. So this is a way of thinking about a kind of divine plan that included industrialization, may have included a revolution or two, but certainly industrialization was considered a positive, optimistic, good thing because it was ordained by God and built upon the foundations of previous thinkers. So every subsequent age laid a further foundation for individuals to finally reach what would have been considered at that point as perfection. Now, we can feed people. We won't have poverty anymore. Famine and these kinds of things are going to disappear. And yes, very optimistic, almost too much so. But Ferguson harnessed all these different forces together, morality, theology, sociology, and industrialization all together, and then reminded us that is that not the direction we were headed all along, right? Every subsequent age on foundation formerly laid. So everything we had done was an increased perfection of what had come before. So quite remarkable words. Okay, along with all of these, Ferguson also thought about innovation being very important. To innovate and become better and better at something was actually more important than simply capital accumulation. And this is a very surprising statement. If you think in Scotland, the Industrial Revolution is only just begun. It's only a few years old. It's in its infancy. And already Ferguson can see that there are going to be some problems. There will be an erosion of moral values. There'll be an erosion of true human connections between individuals. There is going to be probably more of an emphasis on just the accumulation of capital versus innovation to make life better for people. And because of that, Ferguson anticipates many of these critiques that we are going to see associated with individuals like Hegel and Marx. So this is something that is really remarkable. The Scottish Enlightenment saw some of the errors in industrialization literally as soon as it started, that there will be some problems. Yes, on the surface, overall, it's going to be beneficial, but let's be very careful that these other things, which we have already pointed out, are dealt with. Now, one important difference between Ferguson and Hegel and Marx is that this notion of movement being sort of preordained towards some exalted future, there was a lot of sort of zigzagging back and forth, but there were still these foundations that were being built over time. And so what we see in Hegel and Marx is a sort of end point. With Hegel, it was Geist, right? The fulfillment of spirit. Or with Marx, the coming to being of a communist society. With Ferguson, it was more about innovating and allowing the development to continue unabated and kind of open-ended, but still keeping in mind the fact that it is preordained by God, and if that's the case, we need to be mindful of the choices that we make. So he writes in the history, part 5, History of Civil Society, when wealth is accumulated only in the hands of the miser and runs to waste from those of the prodigal, when heirs of families find themselves straitened and poor in the midst of affluence. Sound familiar? When, in short, instead of being considered as the instrument of a vigorous spirit, it becomes the idol of the covetous or of a profuse or rapacious or timorous mind, the foundation on which freedom was built may serve to support a tyranny, and what in one age raised the pretensions and fostered the confidence of the subject may in another incline him to civility and furnish the price to be paid for his prostitution. Wow. That's Adam Ferguson in an essay on the history of civil society, written in 1767, when wealth is accumulated in the hands of the few, right? When heirs to families find themselves poor in the midst of affluence. So we have the 1%ers. This is what Ferguson was talking about. The 1%er, we're already there imagined, if not already there in reality. And he says, yes, this could happen. And I am pointing this out to you to make sure that it doesn't happen. But it still did. So Ferguson was almost overly optimistic as to the kind of world that he wanted. I mean, nothing wrong with being morally, acute and having your moral compass tested and picking the right thing to do. But already he was saying wealth being accumulated in the hands of the few, instead of being an instrument of a vigorous spirit, an innovative spirit. No, it's in fact the idea of wealth as being coveted, being kept. Someone who simply wants to hold on to money because it makes them powerful. So money here, wealth, is not something that will innovate, but will in fact serve to support a tyranny. And this is what ends up happening, so that the individuals who are left behind, the 99%, have to essentially prostitute themselves in order to stay alive. Those are damning words. And this is from a guy who believed in God, believed in Aristotle's ethics of virtue, and still says this. So, yes, they may have been optimistic, and yes, they held out hope, but they weren't blind. They were not blind whatsoever. The price to be paid for is prostitution. Holy cow. That is pretty strong stuff. So, other thinkers like Hume and Smith, they too were creating new ideas based on laws of commerce and social refinement. What Ferguson was really pointing out to us was something that was, at this point, not clear. So Ferguson's view may have been more ambivalent, but it's because the idea wasn't there in its full realization, which is basically social alienation and social enemy, which is what it means. So as much as Ferguson wanted to prefer military might, virtue, communal bonds, especially those in smaller communities, he was also very much aware of social enemy. And that's the lack of normal ethical and social standards. It's every person for himself. It's what can I get out of you? Every interaction is transactional. It's, what can you give me? And so social enemy is the beginnings of what became basically social alienation. And throughout the 1800s, poets struggled with this and writers struggled with this because it was there. It didn't have a clearly defined term. So Ferguson's view may be considered ambivalent, but he too was struggling with the same thing. This idea of alienation, alienated from work, alienated from family, alienated from community because you have to go somewhere else to work. So all of these ideas really kind of gestate over a period of almost 100 years, and they actually end up coming out in the work of the French sociologist Émile Durkheim. And yet there it is, right? There's the idea in its infancy in the work of Adam Ferguson in 1767. So social enemy and normlessness, right? It's a state where expectations of behavior are unclear. The system starts to break down. Duties become more difficult to define. And our relationship to each other and to society is that much more difficult to predict and also to map out. So the second person we want to look at, another Adam 2, is Adam Smith. And he lived slightly longer or later than Adam Ferguson, also a moral philosopher and considered to be the pioneer of political economy. And he has a couple of very, very important books, The Theory of Moral Sentiments, which is interesting because he was writing about political economy and society, but a book, The Theory of Moral Sentiments, and in the book he's probably best known for is an inquiry into the nature and causes of the wealth of nations. So it's usually just called The Wealth of Nations, written in 1776, the same year as the American Revolution, interestingly enough. And this particular book is really considered the first modern work of economics. Now, it's here in a course on the history of philosophy because Smith was primarily a moral philosopher. Just because of his interest in economics and society, he was still a moral philosopher, and a very good one at that, but his interest was in understanding the world around him. And the world around him was primarily economic. It was now changing. So he laid the foundation for free market economic theory, also the academic discipline of economics. But the main difference, the part that a lot of people tend to forget, is that he was still a moral philosopher. So this is what we want to look at. So The Wealth of Nations is a really fascinating book. It talks about globalization and tariffs. It identifies labor and capital as one of the three, or land, labor, and capital together, as one of the three factors of production and the major contribution to the nation's wealth. So land, right? That's the first word. Now, we should be reminded of what we just read a few moments ago from Ferguson's book, right? The first person to stake a chunk of land, put a fence around it, call it their own. There's Smith's going, yeah, that's the first most basic element of an economic society. So land, labor, and capital are the three major factors of production and contributors to a nation's wealth. So the gist of the book is looking at how these three things, really prior to that it was agriculture, but now it's these three things: land, labor, and capital. And the very first thing that Smith talks about in his, again, somewhat optimistic view of industrialization is this thing called the division of labor. And that would increase labor productivity through specialization. And this idea is still today used as a sort of primary model for efficient capitalist production. It's also called Fordism. This is, of course, Ford, the car company, perfected a new division of labor. But the whole idea of dividing labor into specialized tasks was one of the ways in which productivity could increase tenfold. Now, the other really interesting issue with Smith is the way in which people, through their self-preservation, remember that theme starts with Hobbes and continues on into the work of Smith, and of course Ferguson as well. But Smith has something really interesting to say about this notion of self-preservation. And his metaphor is what he calls the invisible hand. And the invisible hand is the way in which individuals come together almost by fate to exchange goods and services. And he believed that one of the ways in which a state or a nation could promote its wealth is by making sure that this invisible hand helped to bring people together. Now, prior to speaking about the invisible hand, he does really praise to a great degree this division of labor. The greatest improvement in the productive powers of labor, writes Smith, literally the first sentence of the first chapter, and the greatest part of the skill, dexterity, and judgment with which it is anywhere directed or applied, seems to have been the effects of the division of labor. So this division of labor is absolutely crucial to the betterment of industrialization and the increase in the creation of goods. But he goes on in book 4, and these chapters are fairly short, and the books as well, although collectively it's probably about 400 or 500 pages long. So here is Smith's notion of the invisible hand, which is taking into account Hobbes's notion of self-preservation, but applying it to an economic context. And he writes it this way: every individual necessarily labors to render the annual revenue of the society as great as he can. He generally, indeed, neither intends to promote the public interest, nor knows how much he is promoting it. By preferring the support of domestic to that of foreign industry, he intends only his own security, and by directing that industry in such a manner as to produce may be of the greatest value, he intends only his own gain, right? That notion of self-preservation. And he is in this, as in many other cases, led by an invisible hand to promote an end which was no part of his intention. And then the killer here, by pursuing his own interest, self-preservation, he frequently promotes that of the society more effectually than if he really intends to promote it. In other words, when that individual goes out and spends money because they want to buy stuff that satisfies their desires and wants and needs, they're actually advancing and promoting the betterment of society. So that invisible hand brings together people who are looking for goods and services and those who are selling goods and services. And that invisible hand brings them together. And as a result, even though people are selfish, narcissistic, filled with self-preservation, the very act actually helps society and economics grow. By pursuing his own interest, he frequently promotes that of the society more effectively than if he really intends to promote it without even trying. This is what we're doing. So the notion of an invisible hand is a very, very important idea that Smith presents to us as to basically how an economic system works within a society. So it highlights his belief that when an individual pursues his or her own self-interest under conditions of justice and morality, he too, right, as a moral philosopher, never lost sight of that. He or she unintentionally promotes the good of society. So self-interested competition in a free market is a good thing. And Smith argued that it would benefit society because it would keep prices low. Again, good idea, didn't happen. Because what tends to happen these days, if one person raises the prices on one product, everyone else does as well, because they can see they can get away with it. So hasn't quite worked out this way. So is it immoral? Yes, it is. Is it underhanded? Yes, it is. But Smith hoped, like Ferguson had hoped, that we would not lose our moral compass. And eventually we do. So Smith, like Ferguson, was not adverse to warning, right, the kind of collusive nature of economic interests, monopolies, oligarchies, anything that would work against the betterment of society. And of course, what ends up happening is once you end up in a position of power, is you get to call the shots. You get to pressure politicians to change laws to benefit you at the expense of everyone else. So Smith he wasn't blind, right? As a moral philosopher, he saw these things. And he said, look, any collusive activity, oligarchies and monopolies where one person controls many things, never good, because it will restrict supplies and raise prices. He got that part right. So Smith saw the importance of the division of labor, but what he did not anticipate was how that organic solidarity, right, that deep, abiding interrelationship of people in that Aristotelian city-state would now end up breaking apart and differentiate in that mechanical solidarity of capitalism. And that, unfortunately, was considered progress. Now, was it good? No. And the reason why Ferguson and Smith remind readers that this may be God's ordained plan, they're also reminding those that are engaging in underhanded activities, someone's watching you, right? Someone's watching what you're doing. You know this is wrong, but you're doing it anyway. So the end result is the world begins to change from this organic solidarity of these deep and abiding relationships between people into this mechanical solidarity of capitalism. And it's almost as if society itself is divided into labor, right? Because depending on where you live, certain neighborhoods will allow certain types of people to live and not others. If you're part of the working class, you kind of get looked at if you move into a rich part of the city, etc. And this is just all human behavior. So progress, right? Progress in this context is not a moral advancement. It's more of a kind of mechanical economic advancement. So very quickly, the notion of progress in this world begins to really become polluted and prostituted, right, to economic interests. So what we consider to be progress in terms of human progress, a betterment of morality, a betterment of virtue, is in a sense crushed, right, by industrialization, because it wishes to call the shots, it wishes to continue to progress, but it doesn't want anything in its way. So business monopolies, dominated political systems, and again, this is one of these remarkable statements in Smith's book that echoes through the next 200 years. Smith warned that a business-dominated political system would allow a conspiracy of businesses and industry to influence politics and legislation to their own ends. This is not something that someone said in 1972. This is 1776. Smith was no dummy. He knew exactly what people were capable of doing. And in that sense, he's kind of a Hobbesian, isn't he? Because he sees not people's better nature like Locke. Yes, Smith is optimistic, hopes against hope, but he's a Hobbesian in the fact that he knows that people can be and will be underhanded. The degree of self-preservation can tip very easily over into having a completely, misconstrued moral compass where, hey, if it increases my profits, didn't you just tell me that God's ordained plan tells me that? No. Morality goes out the window. So here's Smith telling us that a political system that caters to business interests is not a good thing. And he's saying this to us over 250 years ago. And we never learned. We went right ahead and did it. So Smith says, look, a complete absence of preferential political favors regarding business activities will benefit society. So this is what he meant, truly meant, by a free economic system. So free of legal and political entanglements, and just let it play out. Because here's what will happen. In the future, if someone raises their prices, we all go somewhere else to buy the same product. Well, guess what? In a proper mechanistic world, the individual who raised their prices will very likely bring them back down again. But no, it doesn't work this way. Instead, one person does that, they all do it very quickly. So we have no choice. We end up having to pay more. But Smith was very, very clear on any kind of a political system that caters to business rather than to people is maybe not destined to fail, but is corrupt, right? Is immoral. That's what he was trying to say. So he writes in The Wealth of Nations, it is the great multiplication of the production of all the different arts in consequence of the division of labor, which occasions in a well-governed society that universal opulence, which extends itself to the lowest ranks of the people. So the wealth of that nation extends all the way down to the very bottom so that everyone can participate. Every workman has a great quantity of his own work to dispose of beyond what he himself has occasion for. And every other workman being exactly in the same situation, he is enabled to exchange a great quantity of his own goods for a great quantity, or what comes to the same thing, for a price of a great quantity of theirs. So the exchange of labor for money, the exchange of goods, all of these things should be allowed to happen in a well-governed society. And if that is the case, then we will have happy workers. We're going to have individuals that are able to live in such a way that they are not going to be suffering while others are just basically bathing in great amounts of wealth, kind of where we are right now. We're there, absolutely. So where does all this leave us? Well, it leaves us, first of all, with the foundations of what became anthropology and sociology, and for sure, in the case of Smith, political economy. So Ferguson and Smith were ready to believe in the innate goodness of human beings, which makes them sound a little bit like Locke, my mistake. But as realists, right, as empirical realists, they sound more like Hobbes, right? The innate badness of people, the fact that people will make these mistakes. At this particular time, these are only warnings. And so that overall goodness in people is what both Smith and Ferguson hope will win out in the end. So Smith was equally ready to believe in the innate goodness of human beings, such as the notion that success for a few individuals would mean success for all of society. And Smith has at no point has ever been called a Marxist or a lefty. He really wasn't. He was a capitalist, but on his terms, so that our moral compass remains intact. We are able to understand our duties. We're able to understand virtue and morality in making the right choice. And morality and goodness, if that is not taken out of the equation, then yes, we can have a good society that is beneficial to all. It's going to help everyone. But that's not quite what happened. So about 100 years later, the anthropologist Emile Durkheim, who we see here, he would end up picking up some of these ideas originally presented in Smith's work and talks about the rules of conduct and thought based on religious beliefs. These you could call duties, for example, and how they tend to erode and weaken in the face of capitalist production. The fact that we would like to perhaps be somewhere else other than working, we don't have that option anymore. We can quit our jobs, but then we may end up in poverty. So everything we do will have a causal reaction, or at least a causal interaction. And so we need to be very careful that whatever rules and conduct that we engage in aren't going to harm us in the short term or the long term. But Smith is still ready to believe in the goodness of people, that they will make the right choices, and that the wealth and success of a society means the wealth and success of everyone, not just the 1%. But because that was not the case, Emile Durkheim began picking up some of these ideas and kind of exploring them a little bit further. He said, those ideas that you had, Ferguson and Smith, about God's ordained plan and God looking down on people and God directing us to make moral choices, here's what Durkheim had to say. He says, look, a religious belief needs a community to support it and let it flourish. The division of labor, together with the free play of economic forces, actually weakens the link between God and various political and economic and scientific functions as society moves forward. So the very glue that needs to hold people together on those deeper levels, not economic levels or transactional levels, but on actual human levels, those begin to erode as modernity keeps on moving forward, and industrialization is the motor that drives modernity forward. As it continues to do that, it now starts to compromise religious beliefs and the communities that support those beliefs. As they weaken the community, they weaken belief, and they weaken the influence of religion on the behavior of individual people. So modernity instead does a whole range of other things that are not going to help people and get them to eventually just be confused, right? Suffer in a kind of enemy. So Durkheim says modernity is marked by the following: a questioning or rejection of tradition, that would be postmodernism, the prioritization of individualism rather than the collectivity or the community, individualism, freedom, and formal equality. So there is the idea of economic freedom at the mercy of human freedom. Faith in scientific and technological progress. This is another complaint of postmodernist thought. Rationalization or professionalization. Specialization is another one, right? The notion of a division of labor in the real world, not just the economic world. Movement towards capitalism and the market economy that is now global, right? It isn't just individual countries. Now there are multinational corporations. We have industrialization, urbanization, secularization, which is a lack of religious thought, the development of the nation state and its various institutions. This is Durkheim at the very, very beginning of the last century. So again, some of these individuals are remarkably prescient, right? They see into the future by looking at the present, right? Anchoring those ideas, those concepts in a real world. And so Durkheim says, yes, Smith and Ferguson, the reason why your view of economics failed is because the very act of industrial progress kills religious belief. There you go. And instead, it replaces all of these other aspects of modernity, which are not conducive to a living human community. Rejection of tradition, prioritizing the individual, faith in science and rationalization, movements of capitalism, market economy, everything that is antithetical to a kind of moral viewpoint that both Smith and Ferguson were hoping that we could continue to have. Now, it's not their fault. They pointed out the faults of industrialization and capitalism. They saw them, but they were unable to stop that movement towards modernity as Durkheim would see it about 100 years later. So he writes in the Division of Labor and Society, the regression of religion is thus linked to the fundamental conditions of the development of societies, and it shows that there is a decreasing number of collective beliefs and sentiments, which are both collective enough and strong enough to take on a religious character. And he says, that is to say, the average intensity of the common conscience progressively becomes enfeebled. So the regression of religion and religious thought is almost necessary for the development of society along these lines of modernity and industrialization. And what happens is, as this is allowed to happen, God's ordained plan or not, it decreases the number of collective beliefs and sentiments. And we all are just free-floating satellites. And that is what social enemy is. We don't know who we are. We don't know what our duties are. We don't know what those connections are that keep us together. So social enemy is another word for social anxiety and social alienation. So here are these individuals writing in the 1770s and already describing something that did not even have a name until the mid-1800s. And so Durkheim saw it, and Smith and Ferguson laid the foundation for moral thoughts regarding these particular ideas. So there you go. That is our look at the Scottish Enlightenment, Adam Ferguson and Adam Smith, the revolutions that surrounded their work, and in some concluding thoughts, seeing their ideas as the foundations of anthropology. So we'll see you again next week. Hopefully you enjoyed it, and we'll be back for more information. Take care and see you soon.